In today's video I will continue painting the Warcrow Starter Box The Winds from the North, but this time focusing on the human side of the set. If you're interested in the orc side of things, then check out the previous video on the channel where I painted the northern tribes. I'll put a link into the corner for you to click. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Balance Miniatures. And as a reminder, the idea behind this two-part series is to paint the starter set in a way that gets close to the look of the box art, but without spending an eternity doing it, so that we all can enjoy a fully painted set in a relatively reasonable amount of time. For the Northern Tribes I ended up spending around 8.5 hours for the 7 models, but I have to admit that the Hegemony and their dastardly gold trims and tiny details slowed me down, and these guys took me 9 hours and 45 minutes to complete. It is not exactly a small amount of time added up, but if you want to cut it down further, you could simply stop at the contrast stage at 5 hours for 14 models and then pick and choose whatever you like from the highlighting steps to fit your quality requirements. Or you can spend way more time than me to refine the highlights for an even better result if that's your jam. Alright, all those gold trims will not paint themselves, so let's get going. Once I had the zenithal undercoat in place, it was time to block in all the colors on the minis with contrast paints. To be honest, contrast paints were more effective on the orcs because they had a lot of complex textures on them like skin, fur and leathers, whereas here we are dealing with a lot of flat black surfaces of armor. But I still decided for the contrast because it's so fast to apply and it is consistent with the method I used for the other half of the box, and also because the end result will still look a bit more interesting and less flat compared to base coating them with normal acrylics. Just like with the orcs, I focused on the colors that most of the models share and tried to find the best colors to use so that later on I can highlight them up from there. I was also trying to share as many colors among the humans and the orcs as possible so they look like they are in the same environment. For example, for the leather straps they are wearing and the tactical rocks they are standing on. There are some new colors of course, since they are different factions after all. The Mantis Warrior Green would have looked a little out of place on the humans, so I used some Gilliman Flesh for the faces instead. And because these guys are wearing this special type of black metal armor according to the lore, I painted it with Black Legion contrast rather than the Black Templar I used for the orcs. In the highlighting phase we can differentiate it even more. For the armor I was contemplating trying to leave the trims unpainted and to use some orangish or red contrast paint on them as a basis for the gold, but I quickly abandoned this idea and simply painted them black for now. I will talk more about that later, believe me. And just like with the orcs, I played with the hair color a bit as well. All of the models got ginger hair, including the leader. I thought it would be interesting for them to all come from a region where people have ginger hair for no other reason than the rule of cool. In the previous video, I talked quite a bit about the tricks and tips of the application of contrast paint, so if you're looking for advice on that, check out part 1. The method is exactly the same as with the orcs. Moving on from the shared colors, the special characters also had some unique elements on them. The Frostfire Herald, the elf magician character, has a huge billowing cloak which is purple on the outside and beige color on the inside, plus he also has a big bluish magic effect that casts a blue OSL effect on him. And Drago the Anvil, the leader character of the Hegemony, also has a big two-colored cape, but this one is beige and black with some gold decorations, and he also has a red scarf on his chest. Finally, the War Surgeon is fully covered in a black robe that I decided to paint in Black Templar instead of Black Legion, and I will be changing it up a little bit more in the highlighting phase. When I had most of the base colors applied on the models, I decided to do something about the gold trim to differentiate it from the rest of the armor and prepare the ground for the highlighting phase. Instead of a contrast paint, I used a normal paint, whole red for this step, and I basically edge highlighted all of the trim. If you're not planning to do a lot of highlighting and want to save a lot of time, I would advise to immediately go with a brighter color resembling gold like Japanese brown or even Sahara yellow or some metallic gold color. Not gonna lie, this step is kinda tedious and difficult, and it is a sign of things to come if you want to do something resembling gold non-metallic metal on these guys. The details are tiny and they are not always neatly sculpted onto the models. Some of the edges you can simply paint by running the edge of the brush over them, and some of the details are raised enough that you can simply overbrush the paint on them, but not nearly all of them. And when the detail is not there, you will have to either leave it unpainted, which won't look good, or you can paint it in with the tip of the brush if you're up for it. This step took me a little bit shy of 40 minutes, so a significant chunk of the whole base coating process, but to be fair, already this first step of painting gold adds a lot of detail onto the armor. For the bases, I decided to go with the same style that I also did for the orcs and use the same colors as well. On the box art they are slightly different. The orcs are standing on an early winter field with some rocks, dried up grass and snow, but the humans are on city bases. But here I wanted them to all be on the same battlefield, specifically the board that came in the box, which is consistent with the orc bases. A muddy village with a little snow on the rooftops and ground. So to make it nice and thematic, both armies will be sharing the same aesthetic. And with that, now we have all the colors on the models, and the orcs looked quite good already after the contrast phase, but these guys, since most of the elements on them are quite dark, these need a little bit more detail to be passable, I think. So let's start the highlighting step with something fun that will immediately help us make these models look way more detailed. That is to say, let's paint some pants. And yes, it's a little funny that I consider painting pants fun, but that's because I already know what came after. If you followed the org guide, you already know what we are about to do here. I will rely mostly on the highlights left behind by the contrast paint over the zenithal highlight. And the goal is to brighten up those highlights and add some details with the help of little scratches in the darker areas, but without touching the deepest shadows. Then I come in with the brighter color and do the same thing, but now inside the highlights I created in the first step, and only doing the scratches in the midtones, but leaving the shadows alone. And I can be quite rough here, and I don't need to care much about smoothness and blending, because right after this step I will paint a lot of stripes over this that will help us obscure the roughness. Doing the stripes is super easy as long as you follow a couple of simple rules. First of all, plan where the stripes go before you start painting them. You need enough space to fit them, so it can be a good idea to paint a thin line first and then expand them once you have all of them placed. And the stripes need to go mostly straight from the top to the bottom, so all you need to do is to paint a continuous line with roughly the same pressure applied to the brush along the way to make it the same width. But some of the characters are bending their knees, stepping on those nice tactical rocks, so there the line will also need to follow the curve of the leg slightly so it doesn't look unnatural. The folds in the fabric you can mostly ignore unless they are big. We are going for something simple here after all. For the edges of the stripe with the darker color, I would suggest painting those inside the stripe, not outside of it, if that makes any sense. Because this way you won't make the white fabric part smaller by reducing the space between the stripes. Finally, I paint the highlight color everywhere where something is raised and not in shadow. So for example, on top of a fold or on the entire stripe on top of the leg, but not on the bottom where it is in the shadow. Okay, now we had our fun with the pants and it's time to forget about fun for a while and attempt to do the non-metallic gold on those pesky trims. But the thing is that those trims are the defining features of these guys. They mark the edges of the black armor so the viewer can see what is what on those really small models, and as such they are quite important. But at the same time, it's basically impossible to paint a proper non-metallic gold effect on something small like this without spending a lot of time fiddling with it, at least for me. So instead we are going to do what I call the poor man's non-metallic, something that will hopefully read like gold when you look at it at a table distance, but if you zoom in on it too much, it won't really hold up to scrutiny. First I painted all the edges with Japanese brown on top of the whole red that we already had done before. I did my best making this highlight a little bit thinner though than the whole red so that the red serves us as a panel lining and the shadow creating a slightly better definition on the models. The goal is not to do perfect edge highlights on every trim, but to create a single high contrast transition on them. I throw in a couple of edge highlights on the larger surfaces where I can, but high contrast will be our main weapon to sell this. Normally I would spend a lot of time making this neat and perfect, but this time I tried to get it as close to okay as possible and then just leave it like that. That being said, where I really messed up, I used a little black or whole red to neaten it up. But I tried to resist the temptation to do a lot of cleanup because this was already taking a ton of time and I didn't want to put twice the time into the humans as I did into the orcs. The models are small, so from a distance mistakes will be hard to see and we can still correct some of that when painting the highlights on the black armor. Once I did this on every model, including the female soldiers, which are even smaller than the men, I switched to a brighter second highlight and did the whole thing again, but now on a smaller surface, leaving around 30-40% of the trim painted in the previous color. Finally, I used the brightest highlight color only very sparingly, sometimes just painting small dots, giving the impression that the light is glinting on the edge. This little exercise took me around 3.5 hours to complete on all the models, and I'm not gonna lie, it made me remember the much bigger and much easier to paint orc models quite fondly. And I really wanted to go back to painting pants instead. For some reason I thought that the humans would be easier to paint, even though my experience is always telling me that the smaller the model is, the more pain it is to make it nice. But let's try to forget the horror of the gold trims a little and move on to painting the much more fun black bits. Fortunately, this was quite simple. Whenever I had space on an armor panel, I painted a straight thin line with the first highlight color parallel to the gold trim. Ideally, you want to have the gold trim, then a thin black line followed by a line of French blue. On some of the large surfaces like the middle of the shields and the top of the helms, I also created bigger scratchy highlights with this color to imitate light reflections. Once I was done with this first highlight, I went in with the second brighter color and tried to do a thinner line inside the first one whenever I could, or partially painted over the previous one and left a little bit of the darker one behind where it got tighter. And when I was done with that, I took a little Crossfigure Scales contrast, added around 50% water to it and glazed this over the entire surface of the black panels, but I wiped it away from the highest highlights on the big surfaces. The end result looks similar to the effect you see on the box art, but a little rougher, of course.
This step added another 1 hour and 15 minutes to the clock, so I was already close to the 5-hour mark with a lot more highlighting I wanted to do. So let's do some smaller unique elements.
For all the black bits that are not armor, like the robes and cloaks of the characters, I used a different set of highlight colors to differentiate them from the armor. All the cloaks, both in and outside, are big surfaces that can look quite patchy painted with contrast, so we need to hide that, but creating nice transitions takes a lot of time, so once again I turn to my favorite method of creating textures with scratches. The idea is simple. You create a lot of overlapping scratches with the first highlight, a little bit like a crosshatch pattern, and then inside these you do the same with the second highlight. Finally, you glaze over it with a contrast color to integrate them into the base color and into each other. On small minis a couple of arm's length from you, your eyes are searching for details to pick out, and your brain hates large surfaces without details. So these scratches, which are concentrated on the parts that should have more light, are easy for your brain to interpret and give you the impression that you are looking at something with lots of details. Then the leather bits were next, and these were quite simple to do. I highlighted both edges of the straps with the first highlight mostly using the side of the brush, and then I painted the second highlight only on the top edge. And for the last common element shared among most of the models, I painted all the faces. Here all the raised elements got a layer of the first highlight, then the most prominent bits showing under the helmets like the bridge of the nose, the upper cheeks and the chins got a touch of the second highlight. Finally, I glazed a little magenta between the shadows and the first highlights. Just make sure to make this quite watered down, otherwise they will look like clowns. By this time I was really running out of time and I was quite tired as well, so only some of the models got proper eyes. Some of them can't really be seen under the helmets anyway, so those can just remain dark. For the rest, I did the usual dark color, whole red in this case, in the entire eye socket, then paint the middle of the eye off-white, and finally a little dot in the middle, but touching the upper edge of the white eyeball.
With this done, I only had to finish the magician's cape and the blue magical effect coming from his book and the staff.
For the cape, I used a similar cross-hatching texture method I did on the leader character's cloak as well, but this time with pink colors inside the original magenta and then integrated it together with a wash. For the magical effect, I simply overbrushed the first highlight on all the raised surfaces, and then I did the same with the second highlight, but making sure that it goes mostly only inside the first one. And finally, you probably guessed it, a wash over them to integrate it, and I was finally done with the highlighting stage. I added the same tufts and snow texture I did for the orcs to tie them into the same environment, painted the base rims black, and called it a day after 9 hours and 45 minutes of painting. And the end results look like this. It is always a huge challenge for me to paint a whole box in a single long project, and I am always exhausted by the end, but at the same time it's so awesome to see the models together like this. They might not be great individually, but together as a group they look pretty darn good, I would say.
But what do you think? Do you like them? Do you think 18 to 19 hours of painting time is realistic for a box like this? Do you plan to paint yours for longer, or do you just slap on a coat of contrast paint and start playing? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like the content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and see you guys in the next one.